When I first moved to New York City, it was the loneliest time of my life. I left my family, friends, friendships I had in seminary, old friendships. It was lonely. The only folks that I knew when I moved there were my supervisors, a couple of supervisors that I had in my clinical pastoral education program. I remember walking the streets of New York because I love to walk and I enjoy just exploring the city. But I know that there was a part of me that was trying to avoid that feeling of loneliness. Because when I got back to my room, I had to be by myself. I would eat alone. I would travel the city alone. It was lonely for quite some time, and it hurt. It was an aching loneliness. It took some time before I began to build some friendships and find communities that were right for me and to build relationships out of those communities. It just took some time. If you've ever lived in the big city, you know that even though there are millions of people in the city, it can be quite lonely. That loneliness taught me something, and I'm ever grateful for it. I realized how deeply I needed community, how much I needed relationships. I realized on a deeper level that God has created us for community, that God has created us to be in relationship with one another, with all of God's children. And as I grew older, I realized that it wasn't just God's children that I was called to be in relationship with, that we're called to be in relationship with, but all of God's creation. As St. Augustine wrote, we are just a small part of God's creation, that we are called to be in relationship with all of God's creation. And when I say being in relationship, I mean right relationship, where we love and care for one another, where we have empathy for one another and for creation, where we live with compassion for one another and for God's creation. That we're called to be in relationship. That community for us is not just those of us who sit here, but for all of God's children and all that God has created. That's our community. And thus, out of this care and concern that we have for community, justice is just a natural outflow of that. Because if we care deeply for our sisters and brothers, we're going to stand up for our sisters and brothers. We're going to stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers no matter what. And they're going to stand in solidarity with us. We're going to challenge the powers that be that oppress our sisters and brothers if we're in right relationship with our sisters and brothers. We don't need to hear the conversation about global warming. We know that we are called to care for the environment because we are all a part of God's creation. Thus, to be in right relationship with God's creation, we care for the environment. We don't need the conversation about global warming to care. Regardless of what the conversation is, we're called to care because we're all one in God. And I believe that's what Genesis is speaking about this morning. That when God created us to be in relationship. And when we are in right relationship with one another and all of God's children and all of creation, God said it is good. That is good. It is a beautiful thing. I had an opportunity to spend some time with my parents this weekend. And it was such a beautiful time. I love when my son can be there and my wife and we can be there as a family. But there was something beautiful about it, just being, I was telling Jeff earlier, just being alone with them. My dad's still in a rehab center. My mom was home alone. And had some good conversation with both of them. And I remember sitting outside with my dad, outside of the rehab center. And Dad is 80 years old, and he's been in and out of the hospital. He's doing much better. Hopefully he'll go home next week, but he's had a lot of time to think. And do you know what he talked about more than anything? He talked about his friendships over the years. And when he talked about his work, he talked about the people that he met and knew. He could tell me, he was in Parks and Recreation, he could tell me the names of some of the kids that he had in his Parks and Recreation department 40 years ago. He still knew some of the kids' names 40 years later. He talked about his friends and how he's lost so many friends over the years. And what was beautiful about it is that for many of his friends, he was one of the last persons that they talked with. When he knew they weren't doing well physically, he would go to their home and they spent time together and had their last conversations together. And there were several friends that he mentioned that he did that with. And he would say, well, after that time together, they made the transition into God. And there was one friend that he had in Reedsville that toward the end of his life said to his son, I'm going to go see Joe Medlin one more time. And he hadn't seen his friend in years, Jeff. And they drove down with his son 4 hours just to spend the day with Dad and go back home. What I'm saying is what's most important are these relationships. Even when he talked about his work, it was the relationships within the work. We spoke about fishing, and it was the beauty of nature that we appreciated together. And when Mom and I had our conversations, it was very similar. Just remembering family and family events and the relationships over the years. We are created, church, to be in relationship to one another. We are created to be in relationship with all of God's children. We are created to be in relationship with all of God's creation. And we're called to be in right relationship, meaning that we have profound empathy and compassion for one another, care and concern for one another, and for all of God's creation. And out of that, the most natural response is to stand up for justice and equality and fairness and to protect our environment. So I offer this blessing to you, First Church. Let us continue to do the work of being in right relationship with all of God's children. And let us continue the work of being in right relationship with all of God's creation. And let us rejoice as God says to us and speaks to us continuously, saying, it is good. It is good. The work that we are doing, it is good. Amen.